Hey guys, welcome to another interview with the Rocky and Derrick Show. Today we're at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences with
Bryan Stuart.
Who does?
Herpetology. I'm the museum's herpetologist, meaning that I study amphibians and reptiles.
How long have you been studying amphibians and reptiles?
I have been studying amphibians and reptiles for about 22 years.
Did you have a scientist you looked up to as a kid?
Well, I really looked up to almost any scientist who was going out and discovering species in unexplored parts of the world. So many. Of course, I looked up to, of course, Charles Darwin, father of evolutionary biology, but so many early herpetologists, people who studied amphibians and reptiles and went into remote or unexplored areas in the world and found things, and in many cases they didn't come back alive, but they made some important discoveries that ended up in museums and that we continue to research some of their findings today.
What made you want to do this job?
Well, ever since I was a little kid, I've just been incredibly passionate about animals. Everything was animals for me. And the truth is, when I was really young, I was really into birds. And I decided I was going to be an ornithologist, which is a scientist who studies birds. And when I was an undergraduate at Cornell University, I took a herpetology course. So a course in the biology of amphibians and reptiles. And I thought, wow, are these wonderful animals? And I've really focused on them ever since. But of course, birds are just feathered reptiles, so I really didn't stray too far.
Have you ever discovered any new animals?
So a lot of my research deals with going into areas of the world that have not been very well studied for amphibians and reptiles and trying to learn what species are there. And in the course of that inventory work, my colleagues and I almost very often discover new species. And to date, I've helped to describe and name more than 40 species of amphibians and reptiles to science. I brought some with me tonight. You want to see them? Mm-hmm. I'm holding a little jar that contains a preserved museum specimen of a tiny little skink, which is a lizard. And this is a specimen that was collected under the leaf litter in the forest in Cambodia in Southeast Asia. So during the last 2 years, I had a grant from the National Geographic Society to work with a Cambodian herpetologist named Ning T, and specifically to try to understand what species of amphibians and reptiles occur on this particular mountain called Bokor in southwestern Cambodia. And so we went out there and we did some intensive survey work for amphibians and reptiles, and during the course of raking through the leaf litter and turning logs on the forest floor, we found these tiny little skink lizards. From where you're standing, they probably looks a little bit like a black worm, but it's a little skink. It's a lizard. It has tiny little forelimbs and tiny little hind limbs. We've brought a few preserved examples of it back to the museum here, and we've compared it to all other lizards in this group from Southeast Asia, and we found that in its morphology, in its external appearance, and in its genetics, so looking at DNA sequence data, that it's different from all other skinked lizards in Southeast Asia. And so what I'm showing you here is an undescribed species of lizard that my colleague T and I are now working to describe as a new species. So perhaps in the next 6 months or so, this will have a name. But today, this little lizard has no scientific name. It's unknown to science. So you're getting a preview.
What type of amphibians and reptiles have you studied so far?
Well, I have had the privilege of working on basically every major group of amphibians and reptiles except for the tuatara, which is its own group of reptiles. They look a lot like iguanas, and they're only found in New Zealand. And they're 2 living species. So that's not a group that I've ever had the privilege of working on, but all the others I have. Most of my work deals with frogs, turtles, and to a lesser extent, lizards and snakes. but I've been lucky to discover and describe new species in most of the major groups. Not a turtle yet. But one of the animals I want to share with you tonight is an amphibian reptile that you and most of your viewers probably have never heard of. I know I certainly hadn't until I really delved into the science of herpetology. When we talk about amphibians, you're familiar with salamanders and newts. You're familiar with frogs and toads. But there's a third living group that you might not be familiar with, and in my view is one of the more interesting of the groups. I'll show you one. It's not alive. This is a preserved specimen. And this is a specimen that we also took on that same field trip in Cambodia recently. This is called a caecilian. So the living amphibians are the newts and the salamanders, the frogs and the toads, and the caecilians. And when you look at this thing, it looks almost like an eel or a worm, or maybe even a snake, but it's an amphibian. This is the closest living relative to the salamanders, and they're totally limbless. They have no forelimbs or hind limbs, and most species of caecilians live under the ground. So they're very, very poorly known because they live only in tropical areas of the world, and they live underground. And so the opportunity to see one doesn't come up very often. And many of the species of caecilians that are known to science are just known only from 2 or 3 or 4 specimens. Doesn't mean necessarily that they're rare, they're just really, really hard to find. And this is a species that only lives in the mountains of southwestern Cambodia and is known only from 3 or 4 specimens. And again, not necessarily because it's rare, because they're just so hard to sample. So I have to say, I'm fascinated by caecilians just because they're such bizarre creatures. They don't really look like an amphibian, do they? What do you think? What does it look like? Snake? What would you have said?
Probably a snake.
Snake, yeah.
Or eel.
Most people say eels, yeah.
When you come across an animal, how do you know that it hasn't been discovered?
That's a very good question. So one thing is, I need to be very careful when I talk about discovery of new species. Every species that I and my colleagues and I have ever described to science has already been known by other people, right? I mean, there are local indigenous people, for example, people who live in the area, in the area where that species occurs, who are very, very familiar with it. So what I have to be very careful with is not to suggest that I or my colleagues are the first humans to ever find this thing, but rather we're the first scientists who know these organisms well enough to see that it's different from all other named species and to be able to give it a name. And so the process of recognizing a new species can be very complicated. Sometimes when we're in the field, we'll find something and it's so different in its external appearance, its morphology. For example, its skin texture, or its size, or its coloration, or webbing, or some aspect of its morphology is so different that we just know right away, wow, we know all of the named species in this group, and this is nothing like we've ever seen or heard of before. And those are what we call novel discoveries. And they happen sometimes, but not all that often. Usually what happens is you find something and it's like that little skinked lizard, where it's a small diminutive species, and you think, maybe it belongs to, you're in the field, you're in the forest, you're far away from your computer, you're far away from the literature, your papers, and so forth, and other specimens in museum collections. And you think, well, maybe that is a new species, or maybe it belongs to this, I'm not sure. And it's not until you get back to the laboratory, like here at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, and you have the opportunity to compare that specimen to specimens of related species, and to look at the DNA of this one and compare it to the DNA of other species, that you really realize, wow, this thing is actually totally different. So there's really kind of 2 kinds of discoveries. One are the really novel things where you just know right away it's so different, and the other is where it takes some time to really look carefully at the anatomy and DNA sequence to really know that you've got something new. So each story is a little bit different.
Do you have a favorite amphibian or reptile?
Oh, that's a good question. It's almost like asking which is my favorite child. I mean, I just love them all, but I think I have a real affinity for, this doesn't exactly answer your question, but I have a real affinity for the species of amphibians and reptiles that are the secretive, small species that are really hard to find and sample, like this one. So not the big, always necessarily the big, colorful, flashy ones, but the ones where you really, really have to work hard to find, where they're not living in places that are obvious to us as humans. Things where you really have to dig for them or look under structure and things like that. And so that includes things like the caecilians, these little skinked lizards, some of the frogs, some of the salamanders, things that are just really, really hard to sample. So it's not a particular species. I think I like the species. I think I have this affinity for species that have those attributes where they're just really secretive and not obvious to find.
Does it ever take like really long when you're like out on your trips to find something new?
Oh, absolutely. And you know, really, what our objective is when we go out on this field work is just to get an understanding of what species occur in that area. And so if we find something new, that's just a bonus. But what we learn is we find records of species that haven't been found in that part of the country before, or even species that have never been known from the country before, even though the species is already known to science. Sometimes we'll make observations on their behavior or other aspects of their natural history, where they're breeding, what they're feeding on, things like that. That can be just as exciting as discovering something new. So sometimes we'll have a field trip where we'll come back and we won't have any new species of science, but we'll have so much exciting data on new observations of species, even if they're already known. And other times we'll go into the field in certain areas that have never been studied, and we'll come back with multiple undescribed species. It really, again, is sort of case by case. Yeah.
Do you see yourself doing this in the next 4 to 5 years from now?
I do. I can't imagine doing anything else. It's just a wonderful endeavor. And the other thing I really want to make clear, though, is the stories that I've been giving you have really focused on traveling to faraway places in the world like Southeast Asia. But actually, you don't have to travel far away to make new discoveries. There are new discoveries happening right here in North Carolina all the time. In fact, here at the museum, we're actually working on the description of a new species of salamander that occurs here in North Carolina. So even right here at home, we don't always know what species of amphibians and reptiles occur around us. And we're still continuously making new distribution records within the state and things like that. So I just want to really emphasize that the opportunity to make important discoveries with amphibians and reptiles is great, and it doesn't always require far expensive travel.
Was there any interesting things that ever happened when you're out in the field?
Oh, every day is something interesting. It's not always just about the amphibians and reptiles. It's a human experience too. I've had the privilege over the last 20 years while working in Southeast Asia just to work with so many wonderful and interesting people. And we've just had so many experiences, sometimes good, sometimes bad, but just really incredible memories. It's an adventure and it's a risk, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. So.
How can people get in contact with you?
The best way would be to go to the website on the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences site and look under research and go to Herpetology, and you'll find me, Bryan Stuart. And you can contact me by email.
In your own words, what advice would you give to kids?
I would really encourage children to never let adults turn you off from the appeal of amphibians and reptiles. So many people find them to be squeamish or unpleasant or have phobias or are fearful of them. But if you're a kid and you're interested in the life around you, I'd say go ahead and pursue your passion. These are really interesting and beautiful animals, and never mind some of the biases that people might carry against them.
Well, that's it for today, guys. Be sure to like, subscribe, and comment. And if you want to become a sponsor, go to our website, rockyderrickshow.com. Goodbye.